Hello everybody, this is Leo and welcome to this Harry Potter tutorial by Blauw Films. I'm actually very excited to share this with you. I've been spending the last week or so creating, or let's say reimagining, the opening title sequences for 3 of the 7 or 8 Harry Potter movies. So I went for the Chamber of Secrets, the Prisoner of Azkaban and the Half-Blood Prince. And really the reason why I did that is that I was watching them and I noticed that there are some very interesting techniques that are being used. And to be honest, when I was about 10 years old, I made a tutorial on YouTube for how to create a Harry Potter opening sequence in After Effects. Now, upon rewatching that tutorial, I noticed that it really needs some work and half the shit I'm doing makes no sense. So I took it upon myself to remake the tutorial, or actually I'm remaking 3 tutorials, one for each of the title sequences that I did. Now today we're starting with Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. In the original, this sequence happens around the evening, right before Harry gets locked up because the Dursleys are having a friend coming over, and that's when Dobby shows up and everything goes to hell. But in this case, I decided to set it at night, to really give that strong color contrast between the gold of the letters and the starry, a bit more magical night sky. And yeah, let's get right into it. So first of all, we need the text animation. Now, I'm here inside of Cinema 4D and I have these layers you're seeing on the right. Each of the letters is separated. And I actually had the pleasure of not having to figure out how to do these letters. There is a great tutorial on YouTube that covers this, and he even left the download file in the description to the actual letters. Have a look in the description of this video and you'll be able to find those too. Now for the subtitles, Chamber of Secrets, I noticed that it didn't completely match this font that I found online. So what I decided to do was to go into Photoshop and create a black and white alpha, and then create a selection path from it, make a new path, and then export it as a Illustrator path. Now what's more interesting is how we actually light this scene. Now first of all, what I've created is a Corona camera, and the camera itself is this one over here, the GC input cam. And if you go, it basically just has 2 keyframes and about 10 seconds of animation. We are just floating through and we're going right in between the Y and the P. Now, there's nothing of crazy animation going on here. I just created a new camera in position, gave it a focal length of 35 millimeters to give it that wide angle lens. And then I just made a keyframe. I moved in between the letters and I put another position keyframe. Thanks to the guys at Grayscale Gorilla, there is a plugin called Gorilla Cam. And what I did is I selected my input cam, went to plugins, and I hit Gorilla Cam. And what it does is, as you can see up here, it creates a new camera that has a Gorilla tag on it. And inside of this Gorilla tag, you can select a scale. So I set it to human. And then you can just either choose one of the presets over here. So let's say Bayham and then 2 Reckless Cops, and if you hit play, you'll see that you'll have this incredibly shaky Michael Bay style camera movement. Now, what I decided to do was I went to Studio and then Subtle Details, and then I lowered these down to be about position medium to be about 3, position fast to be about 2, and then I believe I left these rotations to be about the same. Now, as you can see here, zooming in, we're getting this very subtle animation, these subtle details, I'd say. And it feels as if your camera is floating through the sky. It's not perfectly floating, it's flying, I would say. It's flying through the letters. Now, after you have your settings correct, you just want to go down here where it says baking and hit brute force bake. And as you can see in the timeline, it has created a bunch of keyframes for every single position in your timeline. After that, you can just remove your Gorilla tag, go to tags, Corona camera, and just start working from there. Now, let's get rid of that camera and go back to our Gorilla Cam that we've already made. Inside of the Corona camera tag, there's a bunch of stuff we've changed. First of all, I've clicked on Use Photographic Exposure, and we're using an f-stop of 2.8. Now, this means that our aperture is going to be pretty wide open, allowing a lot of light to come in, and we're going to be creating a pretty shallow depth of field, which is specifically going to be important once we start reaching these end frames of our shot, where we will be creating a bit more depth by having the text out of focus. I simply left the keyframe distance to be all the way in the back. We're not particularly focusing on the Harry Potter text. We're keeping it in focus right now, and as the camera moves, that focus distance stays the same. We're basically constantly getting away from the focus of the Harry Potter text. When we go down here at tone mapping, I've set the highlight compression to be 2. We will be playing with some pretty high intensity values in the lights, so highlight compression is a must in my opinion. White balance 6500. Then bloom and glare, I've turned that on. I believe these are the standard settings, but these were the ones that worked in my example. I turned on sharpening with the default settings. And then we have the depth of field. I have enabled the depth of field, and from a circular aperture, I've changed it to a bladed one, and I gave it about 7 blades. For the advanced bokeh effects, I've put the center bias to 1, the vignetting to 1, and the bokeh anisotropy, I've put that to negative 0.5. Now, negative 0.5 creates a vertical oval bokeh, similar to what you would get in a film shot on anamorphic lenses. Alright, now let's look at the lighting. So first of all, I have this Corona sky over here. And as a skylight, I've not done too much that's crazy over here. I've used this Industrial Sunset HDRI from HDRI Haven, and I've put the intensity to 4. Now, you might already be thinking, that's a bit strange, why are you using a daytime HDRI to be playing inside of the nighttime scene? Well, basically what I'm thinking is, I'm going to be creating this contrasting look. And when I was doing this, I felt confident enough in being able to blend the look of the Harry Potter text with the background, as if it's not like integrated in the same location, but it does feel like it's supposed to be together. At the end of the day, it's a relatively stylized, or well, let's say it's a very stylized shot. I followed up by creating a sun, which is right up here, Corona Sun. I'm using a size of 1 to get some harsh shadows and a intensity of 10. Now, the reason why I'm using, let me show you exactly where I've placed the sun. So 264 rotation, angle of 60. As you can see, this dot over here is the sun. And if I follow it, you'll see where I'm shining it. Basically what I'm doing is I'm creating these highlights that you're seeing on the screen right now. I'm making sure that these highlights create a nice contour of the shape of these letters. One of the things that I was constantly aiming for during this project is that I do want to give as much plasticity as possible to the Harry Potter text. When it comes to lighting inanimate objects, or let's say product photography or something, you do want to make sure that you use a variety of lights, from soft lights and bigger sources and these very small harsh lights, to be able to create a more clear definition of your shape. If we look at the Harry Potter text itself, and I was just going to be front lighting everything or just top lighting everything, you wouldn't be able to get a feel for how each of these facets is angled on this letter. Because what's most impressive to me about the Harry Potter typeface is the amount of detail that you get in the contouring and in the chiseling of the typeface. So, the rim light, that's our sun. Now, the next layer I have up here is a plane with a black diffuse material. Now, this was supposed to be black, but I'm seeing that, unfortunately, I left the value at 1%. But it doesn't really matter. The idea is to be creating a negative fill, which I have placed on the opposite side of the sun. It's a little bit far away over here, but it's quite big. Basically what I'm doing right there is I'm excluding a large section from the HDRI to show up in the reflections of the Harry Potter text. Basically everything on the left of the Harry Potter letters is going to be darkness. Now, that is one of those little things that will actually help integrating the shot into the background. as well as the rim light from the sun, creating the illusion of the light coming from the moon, or technically speaking, some other object that is not in frame right now. Then we have this light over here. Now this is a simple area light that I've put right on top. It has a intensity of 40 and simply a white color. And I'm using this light to basically give the top of the letters a pretty strong kick and define some sort of a rim light or an edge light that we're getting right on top. And then we have this area light down here. Now, what I noticed is by having this sun over here and this top light over there, it's creating a bunch of shadows that are all falling on the subtitle of the film. And especially because the letters of Harry Potter are pretty thick themselves, there is no real way for enough light to shine through and cast on the subtitle. So basically I created this area light over here, an intensity of 5, color of white, turned off visible directly, turned off occlude other lights, and then in this include tab over here I have included all the layers that are inside of that chamber of secrets and the subtitle window. And now we go on to our two magical highlights. If you want to use moving lights in a film and you want to make it believable, then I would suggest to make sure that the audience is able to understand what the source is and where that light is coming from. Now in this case, what I really want to be emphasizing is the idea that Harry Potter, it's this magical witchcraft and sorcery world. And what I did is I created a corona light, I changed the light type to be object, and I changed the shape to be a sphere. And right here you can see the radius, I've put them to be 70. Which means that they are not as harsh as the highlights from the sunlight, but they won't be that soft that you will be lighting an entire facet of the letters. Now I put the intensity to be 25 and I left them white, visible directly turned off, and occlude other lights turned off. Now I put them inside of a cloner and I changed the cloner mode to be radial. I increased the radius to be 741, which means it's never touching the letters, it's always staying away safely. I went to the first frame and I set a keyframe for the rotation H, went to the end and set a keyframe for 1080, which means that we have 3 full rotations by the end of the shot. Now, I did basically the exact same thing for the other cloner. I've created a corona light that has a radius of 15. Remember, the smaller the source, the harsher the shadows, the bigger the source, the softer the shadows. Think about the sun. It's relatively speaking a small source when it hits us in broad daylight, so you get these very harsh shadows. But then if it goes through a bunch of clouds, that acts as a softbox, becomes a very large source, and then you get very soft shadows. Intensity 25, the rest is the same. And the cloner in this case, I have put the radius a bit down to 150 because we're just really going to be playing around by creating some inner highlights on the sides of the H and some top and mid highlights on the Y, P, and O. I have here keyframed the B rotation and it's doing the same thing. Negative 1080, so negative 3 rotations. Perfect, now let's have a look at the gold material and we can go into compositing. There are 3 materials over here, and let me open the node-based materials so we can all have a look. And okay, so first of all, don't go Merlin's beard on me. If you're not used to working in nodes, don't worry, you can work simply like this and it's the same thing. It's basically the same thing. This material and all these settings are just being represented in this section over here. Now, I will be doing this in nodes simply because I prefer to look at it this way, but, well, you know, you're warned. What I did is I created a Corona new layered material, and inside of this layered material, I have created a base material, which is a rough gold, and I have created a very shiny polished gold. Then I've masked it out with this cavity map. Now the way you set this up is, well, you create your layered material and then you move on to your rough material. Now the way that I make metals is you turn off your diffuse channel, you go to reflection and turn the Fresnel IOR to be 99. Now you have a fully shiny material. For a color, I decided to go for a texture and I went for this fine gold texture that I found from textures.com. In the glossiness, I created a layered material, and as you can see in the layered material down here, there are 4 textures, and I'm using even a height map on a soft light to get a bit more grunge inside of that texture. Then in material 1, I went to a bump channel. I created a Corona normal material channel, and in there I put this texture over here, which is a bronze texture as well in the normal. That same height texture I was using before, I put that inside of the displacement, and I gave it a displacement of a max of 0.5 centimeters and a minimum of 0. Now let me show you what the difference is between the rough material and the shiny material, because there really isn't much. The displacement is the same, the bump is the same, the reflection is practically exactly the same, except for the glossiness, where what I did is, if you look at the layered material, I have removed the dark material that there was, and that's it. Now it's a brighter texture output that we're getting from the layer, and it's looking shinier. So now the input, the rough material is going as a base, and then we are giving it some extra polished highlights on top. So we applied the gold material to each of these letters, and I've put the projection to cubic, and I've set the length to 30 for both of these. Let's quickly go over my render settings and then we can get into After Effects. I'm saving it as an EXR file with an alpha channel. My pass limit is set to 30 over here, but it's just because I render a still. In my actual render, I believe I just went to 15 or something like that, and I put my denoise mode to 0.45. And that was working fine. Now in performance settings, I did go down here at the bottom and I enabled the caustics, and I made sure that it's not only in the caustics pass. And for secondary GI UHD cache, I made sure to set the preset to animation flicker free. And I got it rendered, and this is what it looked like. Now, what I do want to warn you about, the render times for these things are pretty high because the geometry on the Harry Potter text is already pretty heavy, and calculating these reflections and all these moving lights is pretty much of a CPU nightmare. If you're using Redshift or Octane or any of the GPU render engines, I'm sure you'll be having a blast, but for me, I had to render this in 2 or 3 nights where I managed to find some time and wasn't needing the computer. So, good luck. Anyways, welcome to After Effects. So, this is my composition. And let me just quickly show you. We have 39 layers inside of this comp. I will just give you a breakdown of how this is done and you'll understand it's really not that complicated. So first of all, over here at layer 20, this is the first thing that I imported, just the title, and I made a few adjustments to it. So first of all, I went to Effect, Color Correction, Vibrance. As you can see here, I just lowered the vibrance a bit. Then I went to Effect, Color Correction, Exposure, and I lowered the gamma a bit so we get some harsher shadows on the edges. Now I added a curves adjustment. The only thing I did here is by the way, do you guys know how to read these curves? Leave a comment below if you're struggling with that. But basically, I'm selecting the 3/4 highlights over here. I'm bumping that up, making sure that there's a little bit of a curvature here. And if you can see all the way down there, I'm actually lowering the top highlights to not be pure white. After that, I went to Effect, Time, and CC Force Motion Blur, and I added some motion blur in post to this Harry Potter typeface. I then hit Command D and I duplicated that title sequence. The only thing I did there is I added a effect blur and sharpen and camera lens blur. I gave it a blur radius of 56, which is pretty heavy to render. and I put the aspect ratio to 0.5. And then in the highlight settings, I use these settings over here that were only really blurring out the white area of the text. I put that to add and lowered the opacity to 10%. The only thing that does is giving it a little bit more of a bloom and glare, bumping the one that we got from Corona Renderer. I just dragged in the Cinema 4D file inside of our project. Let me show you. So here we have VFX assets and camera tracks, and here it is. I drag that in and automatically you get Cineware popping up. And basically I just selected the camera, hit extract, and that gave us Gorilla Cam. We can start adding some objects in 3D space. And the first thing I did is I added some clouds. Now I do have my own cloud assets, which are the ones that I'm using. So if you need any cloud assets, I've gotta say, mine are pretty good. So here we have the 400 raw cloud pack. Links will be in the description below. 5K images of a whole bunch of different clouds. This one is more for matte painting and compositing, but you can use it for anything. In this example, I've been using this one, the Skyline raw pack, $7.99 over there. If you have your own Skyline assets, mate, just go for it. Use your own thing. If you can find some on Google that are high resolution enough, use your own thing. But in case you need something that's high res and reliable or something, make sure to check these out. So I went in here, I added this bottom clouds asset over here, made it 3D by checking the cube over here, and I positioned it to be 15,000 pixels away. I then scaled it up to be fitting the composition, and I took the mask tool and I just masked out everything on top so we just have the clouds. I have a second copy over here that's just top section. I was going to do something with it. I was going to use some liquify, but I didn't end up using it because our focal point in the shot really wasn't there, and most of this was going to be cropped out in the 235:1 aspect ratio. Then I have the background sky, which is basically the sky from the exact same asset, which I have then pushed back to be 19,000 pixels away. So basically, once we start pushing into here, we will be getting closer to these clouds down here than we will be to the sky in the back. I followed up by adding a adjustment layer with a color correction photo filter. Now I do have a day for night tutorial on the YouTube channel, but basically photo filter is one of the most genius tools to do a day for night conversion. Basically you change the filter to be custom color and then you change the color to be something like this. And ideally you might even want to go more gray, less saturation, but in here what I really wanted to be doing is play with that strong contrast of colors between the Harry Potter text and the blue. Check off preserve luminosity and then turn the density up to 100. And basically what that does is, as you can see, it completely excludes the highlights and just gives a filtration to a certain color. Now on top of that I created this layer over here, which is a bunch of sparkly stars. So we're gonna do a quick detour and get into this star map. Again, if you have your own stars, feel free to use them, but these ones are actually from our own star assets. It's 100 organic stars. These are actually extracted from 23,000 different stars from NASA pictures. Basically, I took a bunch of pictures from NASA and I crunched them out, and then I ran this script that took way too long to execute, and it basically separated every single star from that image. And then I took each one of those images inside of Trapcode Particular and I repopulated a scene in 100 different random permutations of these stars. And I rendered each of them out as an EXR pass, and here you go, $5.99, you can get it. They're great. I've been using them for so many things, and it's the one product on this page that doesn't get enough love in my opinion. Anyways, I imported like a bunch of them, I put them all to add, and then I created this black solid. Layer new solid, made it black, and I gave it a fractal noise effect. I kept it the basic, kept it the soft linear, kept everything about the same. I just lowered the scale to be about 70, and then I hit Alt and clicked the evolution over here, and I believe I put like time 200. No, there you go, time times 250 as an expression. What that does is it cycles through the evolution over here, and this fractal starts moving. And then what I did is I created this adjustment layer over here with a increase of exposure, and I changed the track matte to be Luma matte on the black solid. Now basically what that does is everywhere where the fractal goes and becomes white, we will get a boost of light, basically creating some twinkling stars. Back to here, I've put on a camera lens blur with a radius of 1 and a aspect ratio of, I believe it used to be 0.5, but something changed there. Then I've created this mask that basically chops off every star that wouldn't be onto the sky. Next we have soft light clouds. So basically this is a duplicate of the bottom clouds, and I've given it a tint effect and this curves adjustment where I've drastically lowered the highlights, and I have played around with the midtones and the shadows a bit, and I've put the mode to soft light. I left the opacity at 100. We're basically getting rid of that washed out feeling that we had from the photo filter by still reintroducing some definition in the shadows. I do have a duplicate of that, which I have masked out to be a bit further to the front, almost creating some kind of vignette effect here at the bottom. The next thing I wanted to do is introduce a moon inside of this sky. It's funny to see how most of these tutorials that I've been doing are basically just a amalgamation of a bunch of different other tutorials that I've been doing before, but I've imported this moon assets. You can get those as well, but these are free. There are EXR files of the moon in a bunch of different phases. It's a 360 images. Every single degree of the moon is there. Link is in the description. Download them, drag them in, and they're good to go. I put them to add, gave them a camera lens blur of 3, and then I duplicated them, added a Gaussian blur of 20, duplicated them again, gave them a Gaussian blur of 600, duplicated them one more time, Gaussian blur of 1000, and finally a Gaussian blur of 1200, giving this exponential blur radius that we're getting over here. Then I created this adjustment layer with a circular mask with a feather of 400 and an exposure of 4. And that gives this look over here. As you can see, the feather is even hitting the clouds at the bottom, which is giving this very nice effect. And I duplicated the glow, gave it a feather of 1000, duplicated it one more time, gave it a feather of 1800. And there you go. Now we are getting somewhere. I created this color grading layer that I put in between Harry Potter and all of the background text, lowered the vibrance, and I increased the saturation. I was noticing that what we were getting to right now was an imbalance in our color harmony. So this vibrance made sure that what we initially wanted to do, making sure that the Harry Potter logo pops, still stays as our main priority. The blue from the moon area of the sky is contrasting nicely with the Harry Potter text, and the more grayish area on the other side is making sure that all of our colors do still feel balanced. Cool, now we have a clouds fly through. Pa-pa! I'm gonna enter into that layer and then we'll go back and see what we got over here. How do you do flying through clouds? Technically, you could layer a bunch of stills from clouds and make it work by playing with the opacities, but that's pretty heavy on your viewport. What you could also do if you have some fancy equipment is you could use a render engine that supports VDB files and then import your cloud VDBs and just fly through the volume and render that out. But that's something I wouldn't be doing just simply for a fun, quick video project. So what I did is I went to actionvfx.com and I purchased a few of these fog assets. So basically what we have here is, if you play them in reverse, it feels like you're going through some clouds. The actual footage is just an empty black room and they start filling it up with a bunch of smoke. But in reverse, there you go. You're going through some layers of clouds. What I did is I imported this one and I don't want to put it to screen. There are a lot of videos that I've been seeing that people composite fog or smoke and that kind of stuff by putting a layer to screen. Now what you're doing then is that you're artificially raising the values of your shot. And smoke and fog and that kind of stuff doesn't actually do that in real life. If anything, they are occluding the values. They're lowering your values. So what I tend to do is I duplicate the layer. I play around with the levels a bit on the copy to make sure that we have some clear white and clear black definition. And then I take the bottom copy and I put that to Luma Matte. Then I just pre-compose the two layers and I use that layer as my clouds fly through. Now let's go to the beginning where you can see all the clouds, and let's go through the effects. The first thing that I did is I wanted this cloud footage to match the X and Y wiggle that we're getting from the Gorilla Cam. But I didn't want my clouds to become a 3D layer because that would mean that my camera would be flying through that layer, making it essentially bigger on screen, as I just wanted it to be still because the footage itself is what's creating the illusion that we're flying through something. The way that I went about that is I went into the transform options, not the transform effect, which we'll get to later, but the transform options underneath the cloud pre-comp. I control clicked on where it said position, and then there is this thing called separate dimensions. And it gives you an X and Y dimension, which, you know, it's the only values that we need. So I alt-click both of these, and there is this little expression over here. Basically, this comp, so you select this pick whip over here, and you select Gorilla Cam, that gives you this comp, and then dot, and then transform position 0. And then for the Y, transform position 1. And what are transform position 1 and what are transform position 0? Well, transform position 0 is this one over here, and transform position 1 is this one over here. Now this one would be transform position 2, and that's it. Now what we have is we have a layer that is offset very strangely. But the way to counter that is by then applying a transform effect, which is underneath effect, distort, and then transform down here. What I'm doing with the transform is I'm basically moving the position to be where it should be, and now we have our shot filled again. I've also increased the scale to be 102 just to make sure that we're never going out of our borders. I've then added a curves adjustment. Let's just turn these two off. So this is what we imported, and the curves adjustment then lowers the highlights completely. Now we are only dealing with, as you can see in the top right corner, 0.2 values. So we're already pretty dark on the spectrum. Then I added a photo filter, and here you go. But we're just matching the new look of the clouds. Then there are a few more layers and we're basically almost out of here. What I wanted to do is create this feeling that the moon is so bright that it's even creating some volume in these clouds. So I made this adjustment layer and I gave it a circular mask with a very large feather of 1788. I gave it an exposure of 4, and then I went to Effect, Channel, Set Matte, and I used the alpha channel of our layer 11, which is Clouds Matte. Now let me show you Clouds Matte, basically just a copy of our original Clouds pre-comp that we were just working with. We are set matting and alphaing that layer to make sure that this glow and adjustment layer only appears where the cloud layer actually appears. And we are also using a duplicate of that cloud matte on top of it, and we are luma inverting with our track matte on our adjustment layer. And what that does is make sure that only where it's dark on the footage, only where supposedly it's like thinner or something, that's where the luminance of our adjustment layer will actually show up. So using this technique is actually very powerful, combining a set matte effect to alpha something and then using a luma matte to luma a completely different layer. Now what we did here is simple. I duplicated the combination of the clouds matte and the clouds glow. I lowered the feather to 1000 and I made a copy. And then I lowered the feather to 400 and I made another copy. And there you go. You have the moon shining through, but preserving the details of her fog. All right, what do we have next? So these two layers, that's a matte for Harry Potter, that's a matte for the moon. We didn't actually use these and they stayed turned off. So the next green layer is this one, Volumetric Light, that is lumaing the cloud matte. Let's go. So what you're seeing over here is a 2D representation of volumetric light. It doesn't really behave the way it should be behaving, but it works just well enough to fool you into believing that there's some more depth to the shot. There's this moon plus camera layer, and we will have to go one layer deeper to be able to show you what it is that's going on. First of all, I've copied the Gorilla Cam and I've added it into this layer. Then I've created a solid 50% gray layer, and I have added in the Harry Potter title. I kept the CC Force motion blur, and then I went to Effect, Generate, Fill, and turned the color to be black. The next thing I did is I added the moon, I put it to add, and I added a curves adjustment to make sure that it's very much blown out. Now what we have here is basically a light matte with three values, which is pure white, which will create our beams, blackness, which will block out our beams, and 50% gray, which will act as our neutral that will do absolutely nothing. If I go one step back to our volumetric layer, you'll see that I've pre-composed that, and I have added this effect called CC Radial Fast Blur. Now I have keyframed the center of the light to follow along with the moon because it's not a 3D layer. I have turned the zoom to be brightest. Now it only selects the brightest area. And I've turned up the amount to be 99. And there at some point it's creating these very nice beams, streaks of light that simulate some kind of volumetrics. I then finished it off by adding a curves adjustment that almost completely chops off the mid-range of the image and just slowly grows towards the highlights. And now you have a layer that you can put to screen and fake some volumetrics. Now I'm using an opacity of 65 and I'm using a duplicate of that is really doing the heavy lifting. So this one on top has a set matte on 11 as a alpha. It's only showing up when the clouds are there. This one is having a set matte of the clouds on luminance, making sure they're only showing up when the clouds are bright. That's it. Then we have the camera lens blur that we're putting on top. It's just an adjustment layer that at the end of the footage goes from blur radius 0 to blur radius 15, and it just blurs out the shot, kind of giving it a conclusion, and that's it. Let me turn all these solos off and let me show you the final piece of compositing that I did. I selected all of these layers and I hit pre-compose, and this is where we get. So first of all, we started off with this layer and I added a effect, Distort Bezier Warp. It basically selects all the edges from your shot and adds a Bezier to it. By typing in 30 on the top left vertex, 30 on the top right, -30 on the bottom right, and -30 on the bottom left, it creates this little bit of a curve, almost as if you are shooting through some kind of anamorphic lens, which is the idea that we had when rendering it out in Corona Renderer. Then the next thing I did is I went to Effect, Channel, Shift Channels, and I turned off Take Green From, and I turned off Take Blue From, and left Take Red to Red. What we can do then is duplicate that layer, change red to off and turn green to green, and then add a optics compensation effect with a reversed lens distortion of 7. And once you put that layer on add, you're now adding the red values to the green values. Except for in the corners, we are, thanks to the optics compensation, not completely aligned, creating this little bit of chromatic aberration. You really don't want to overdo it because it looks cheesy as fuck, but a little bit actually works pretty well. It creates this idea that you're getting closer to something, or the idea that you are using a actual anamorphic lens that wasn't very good, I guess. But it's nice. So after I did this with these layers, I went to composition settings and I actually changed the comp size from 1920 by 1080 to 1920 by 817, giving it that 235 aspect ratio and also cropping out the Bezier edges. I went on and created a new adjustment layer with this elliptical mask that I increased the Beziers from the left and right side to be matching the top and bottom side, creating this oval elliptical shape. I then subtracted the mask and gave it a feather of 125, and I added a camera lens blur of 5 with a aspect ratio of 0.5, which matches everything that we've been doing up till now. And I add an exposure effect with a 0.9 gamma correction, just to give it a little bit more darkness and punch in the edges. Finally, we have our final color grading layer. I added a curves adjustment that is basically lowering down everything from the shadows to a little bit of the mids and a very tiny bit of the highlights. I added a tritone effect that simulates a little bit of a film stock look. So I gave the highlights a murky orange color. The midtones are this cyanish moldy color, and the shadows are this very dark purple color. I blended it with the original to about 86%, and then I ended up by giving it an exposure of 0.8 and a gamma correction of 0.9, just to give that final contrast onto the footage. And then finally, some film grain. I have this Cine Classico, and I gave it 2 copies. It kind of washes the footage out a little bit, blending it all together. That's it. Ugh. That's it. And yeah, I'm actually very happy with how it turned out. I had a lot of fun making this. Especially had a lot of fun making the Prisoner of Azkaban one, which includes some snow simulation and some pain in the ass expressions to get Lumos working. But yeah, that'll be my next tutorial. Stay tuned for that. Thank you very much for watching. All the links for all the stuff that I used in this video are in the description below. Just for you to know, again, here you can get the moons for free. If you need some skylines, get these over here. If you have your own ones, use your own ones. Here are the stars. Thank you very much for watching. Leave a comment, rate this video, subscribe to this channel for a bunch of new content. We have just released a horror short film during Halloween. If you like horror, be sure to check it out. If you don't, give it a look, you might like it. We got a science fiction film coming up, fully CG. New content you can expect on this channel is stuff like new tutorials, a bunch of new interviews with the cast and crew, new projects. We'll definitely always be making new projects. And yeah, that's it. Hope you have a great day. Cheers and see you later. Bye-bye.